So in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the surprisingly chaotic development history of the original Final Fantasy VII and how that development cycle kind of changed things for Square Enix moving forward with games like Final Fantasy VIII. So if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new here and you'd like to stick around, you can always subscribe as well. It is always appreciated. So this article comes to us from Game Informer, and they sat down with Tetsuya Nomura, Yoshinori Kitase, Naoki Hamaguchi, and Motomo Toriyama to kind of spill the beans on the really crazy development cycle for Final Fantasy VII and the games leading up to it. And we start off first with Nomura, as he describes Final Fantasy VII being kind of this midpoint entry in the series, not just for the games as a whole, but for the development team making the games. He goes on to say, even within the mainline Final Fantasy titles as a series, we can consider Final Fantasy VII to be this sort of midpoint title that's in the middle of it all. Up to Final Fantasy VI, it was created in a certain way, and then from 8, there was a brand new way of approaching development, whereas 7 sort of sits between those two titles as a sort of mixed element title. 6 included a lot of elements that each department on their own, just on a whim, wanted to include, so they just included it, while 8 is much more calculated and strategized. 7 is a mix of that, where it's both calculated and kind of a at-a-whim type of development. If we made games like this the way we did when we were creating the original 7, we would be in a lot of trouble right now. Times have really changed. Beyond 7 is the point where I'd say times have changed. It's the last of the titles where we were able to do things that way. There were scripts, and then suddenly things that are not even in the script that the character is now saying in the game that we've never even heard of. Some departments just wanted to include the character saying these things. It was that kind of world then, which sounds like it was very messy. From Final Fantasy I all the way to 7, I cannot imagine how you could operate in that type of environment where things are just kind of willy-nilly. And for someone like myself, I'm very OCD and anal. I like things done a certain way, and if I have a plan for something, if someone were to just come in and change it, I would be infuriated. So the fact that they were able to make those games back then with how chaotic that kind of system was, the fact that there was, honestly, it sounded like there was no structure to how they developed games. If someone wanted to have a character say something or do something, they were gonna do it, and it really sounds like there's not much you could have done to stop that. But if we look at the kind of the transitional point for Final Fantasy games, and 7 being that midpoint, as Nomura says, it actually kind of is, especially when you look at the technical side of things. And leading up to 7, Final Fantasy was very much a Nintendo game. It was on every Nintendo console, and everyone assumed that 7 would be on the next Nintendo console, which would be the N64. And there was even a tech demo of what they could potentially do with Final Fantasy VII on an N64 console. And we covered this so long ago, probably a year ago, where Kitase sat down and kind of talked about the development cycle of 7, and he said one of the reasons why they transitioned away from the Nintendo platform and over to Sony was hardware limitations. There was just so much more that they could do with the PlayStation hardware and those CD-ROMs, and so much more data that they could then fit on there that they couldn't with the cartridge. And 7 really is that midpoint of them learning how to use the PlayStation hardware. Because if you look at 7 and you look at 8, visually it's a night and day difference. 7 still carries over those very chibi kind of cute characters. Things are kind of simplified, a little messy, pre-rendered backgrounds look a little fuzzy, and then afterwards, once they seemingly kind of added some structure to their development staff and how they did things, you look at 8 and it looks incredible. The characters, for the most part, all look like human beings. They're all properly proportioned. The pre-rendered backgrounds look a little smoother. The stuff that they could do with attacks and summons, especially the cinematic stuff from the summons, was a big improvement on what we saw in Final Fantasy VII. And there was so much more that they could put onto those games with the data aspect and moving from 3 discs over to 4 discs for Final Fantasy VIII. Now, as chaotic as all of that sounds, it does seem like they did have at least one person that was a bit of a gatekeeper that oversaw everything in terms of the writing and anything additional that was going to be thrown into the game, and that was going to be Nojima. Kitase goes on to say, there were teams working on each character and the things that they say in the storyline, but then overall, Nojima-san was the final reviewer. That's bringing the whole storyline together. That practice was carried on for future titles to have that cohesion. But besides that, it was sort of an anything goes type of world then. Nomura then adds to that by saying, after we finished working on 7, we thought to ourselves, we can't go on making games this way. So from a story standpoint, Nojima was kind of the savior when it came to kind of cleaning things up and really making sure that everything made sense. And I myself, I'm not a writer. I do write scripts on occasion for this channel, but when you look at how people structure out TV shows and movies, a lot of times these people who are writing, the showrunners in particular, will have what are called Bibles, where everything about their story is in it. The characters, the world building, food, every little detail of what's going to shape that story is in that Bible. And I'd be very curious to see if Nojima-san has a Final Fantasy VII Bible that he created back when they were making the original game, and to see what he has in there and what's been added since then for things like Remake and Rebirth would be absolutely fascinating, just to kind of see how he views this world and these characters and how they all kind of started off. Hamaguchi also adds on by saying, nowadays we have localized voice check and stuff like that. You can't just get away with doing these things today. And whatever structure they implemented after 7 made a massive difference, because 8 came out, I believe, in the winter of 1999. And then shortly after that, Final Fantasy IX came out, and then Final Fantasy X came out. So clearly, the structure and things that they were able to implement into that development cycle to really kind of clean things up and make sure that you're not just doing things on a whim clearly had a massive effect. Because you look at that golden period of games from Squaresoft, you had Final Fantasy VII, there was Chrono Cross, there was Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy IX and Final Fantasy X. All of these games came out so close to one another, and they're all really great games. They're high quality. So the fact that they were able to do that is insane, and whatever structure that was that they implemented made a massive difference. And I also hope that it kind of lessened the, maybe not necessarily the workload, but the stress aspect of making those games. Because back then, man, you look at like fighting games especially, I think Harada, who works with Bandai Namco and worked on some of the earlier Tekken games, I think he really came on board as a developer with Tekken 3. There's a lot of really sad and unfortunate stories of these developers not even seeing their families for months on end because they're stressed out making these games. They're sleeping in their cubicles and in the offices, they're not going home, they're not eating properly. So I would hope that was not a situation with the Square people, and if it was, hopefully adding that structure kind of alleviated some things. But also imagine trying to get away with that stuff today. Like Hamaguchi said, you cannot do that. Game development these days is so much more strict. Everything is planned out ahead of time, from the people working on the game to one of the most important things, the money aspect. The budgets of these games have to be agreed upon in advance before you start developing things. And if you go, you know what? I'm going to change this, I'm going to change that, I'm going to add this. There are so many more checks and balances and people that has to go through in order for that to happen. So you cannot have that nowadays. You look at a game like Spider-Man 2, I think the budget for that game was well over $300 million. And now some of that is licensing just to get the Spider-Man character in that world, but man, imagine fucking around with that type of money. The repercussions would be insane. Up next, Kitase talks about implementing real-world situations and experiences into video games and how you can't just do it matter-of-fact in your face. He goes on to say, in Final Fantasy VII, we were able to depict these types of issues like the cycle of life through the concept of live stream. If we were to depict it exactly as we experience in the real world, it would not be very interesting. With Nojima-san's ideas, we were able to have this centered on live stream and the planet within the worldview of Final Fantasy VII. In this way, I believe the game and its themes remain relevant and withstand the test of time. And he's absolutely right on that. And a lot of times when we sit down to play games or watch movies, we're trying to get away from a lot of the stuff in our life. But if you can take relatable things like the stuff that Final Fantasy VII covers, mental health, corporate greed, which we talked about in previous videos, and do it in a way that is a really kind of nice allegory for that world it comes from, it makes it so much easier to digest, I think. And as he said, that's one of the reasons why 7 in particular is still so relevant today, because we do have things to worry about like corporate greed and the health of our planet and mental health, and that's become such a big thing in this day and age. And for me in particular, when I was younger, I didn't quite understand a lot of that stuff, but as I get older, especially the mental health aspect, that just hits home so much for me, and I'm able to really relate relate more and understand the character of Cloud, for example, and what he goes through and some of the issues that he deals with. So they touch upon all of that stuff and they do a pretty good job for the most part. With that being said, that is the video. I'm Curious Corduroy. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below about this really kind of on the whim development structure that they had with the Final Fantasy games that ended after 7. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.